Hi, welcome back to 1138. We're here talking with Bob Barker and Bryan Young about the early films of Lucasfilm, being THX 1138 and American Graffiti. So thank you all for joining. I had to run over here really quick because I was just on with Bobby Moynihan, and we are still taking donations for first. And if you were on the last panel, Bobby Moynihan will match $6,600 if we get 100 people to match D. Bradley Baker's challenge of donating $66 each. So that's D. Bradley Baker and Bobby Moynihan both will match. So welcome. Thank you all for joining us here. And all right, so who wants to go first? We're here to talk about the early films, and I did a recent rewatch of American Graffiti, so that's fresh in my mind. But THX 1138, there's a little thing. So I'm thinking Bob and Bryan will probably be the brain trust here that will remember exactly what happened in that movie. It was a great art house film. It was a joint venture between Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola, and it was shot in San Francisco. So, all right, with that, I'll hand it over to Bryan.
Yeah, THX 1138. It ended up coming out in the very early 70s and was the first film that really came out of the American zoetrope sort of grouping of movies, and it didn't necessarily do well, and it sort of soured Coppola's relationship with some folks down in Hollywood. But I think it's a terrific film. It stars Robert Duvall and Donald Pleasance, among others, and it's set in this post-apocalyptic nightmare of a future where everyone is sort of drugged into complacency, and it's got a very George Orwell sort of vibe to it. And I think that it's just a really rich film, sort of based on George Lucas's student film, which was called THX 1138 4EB, The Electronic Labyrinth. And watching the film, one of the reasons I was so excited to really want to do this panel was because I think if you watch THX and American Graffiti, you can see George Lucas learning how to make Star Wars. And with THX, I think one of the big things in THX is just the soundscape. Walter Murch, who in Star Wars actually kicked off the direction of the Umbara arc on the Clone Wars, was an old college pal of George Lucas's and really helped him build the soundscape. And I think it established what Lucas realized could be done with sound in movies, and really primed him for that partnership with Ben Burtt later.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite films too. It is the gold standard of dystopian nightmares, and it gives us something we hadn't seen before. We've seen the 1984 type dystopian nightmare of an oppressive regime. We've seen the consumer abundance of Brave New World, and this is somewhere in between. And I tell you what, if you ever want to hear an exuberant, happy, joyous George Lucas movie commentary, it is the THX 1138 commentary. Because he's excited, because there's nothing bad of that experience of making that film that he had. And I was re-listening to it last night. I mean, I've seen the movie a bunch of times, but I haven't watched the commentary in years. And you hear where he's coming from. He's wanting to provoke emotions. He admits this is a strange little art house film. There's not a lot of dialogue. Look, Robert Duvall doesn't talk for half of the film, but he is carrying the action forward, and he's miming and pantomiming. He's doing all these things so it carries the movies on his shoulders. And I just don't think people knew what it was, and that's the problem. They thought they were getting Buck Rogers or another sci-fi fare, and they got a stark dystopian, which is pretty much in line with the dystopian nightmare sci-fi films of the early 70s, late 60s. It was perfect. It was that big tonal change.
One of the things I really love about it is that you can track in Star Wars is how it really drops you in without any exposition. And it feels very much like, I'm not sure if it was in the commentary or if it was in the documentary Fog City Mavericks. He talked about he and Walter Murch talked about how they really wanted to make it feel as though this movie was an artifact of the future and drop you right into it. And it feels like that, right? Like it's this relic of the future that isn't yet. And there's this urgency to the dialogue, even though you don't quite understand what anybody's saying, that feels very much like the opening scenes of Star Wars, right? Like there's this, you can tell that the important things are happening, even though you don't know what the hell anybody is saying. And
I think the term is in mes redia.
In media res.
In media res, yeah.
Well, but more than that, though, because he's not just dropping us in the middle of a situation. He's doing it with the world building. He's letting us collect all the information about the world building without spoon feeding it to us, and creating this really wonderful sense with the visual storytelling that I don't think he gets enough credit for on any of his movies, right? Like there's sequences in this where it's just sort of people pushing buttons and then seeing shots of what those buttons might be doing. And it reminded me a lot, actually, in rewatching The Phantom Menace, the moment in the pod race where Anakin is putting the fires out in his pod engines and repairing them, right? He's just pushing a whole bunch of buttons that actually, were just made up by the designers there and didn't actually do anything. But Lucas was able to shoot it and edit it in a way that made us feel like something was actually happening. And I think THX is really where he learned how to do that. And it goes right down to the light up editing panels and bays that he was shooting in that we end up seeing like in the Death Star control room in A New Hope. Even, it's part of that aesthetic and part of his method of storytelling that really he was able to hone on THX.
My background's in electrical engineering, and it's really cool to look at this because people don't realize the late 60s into the 70s was the transition from pneumatic controls to electronic digital controls. And in the commentary, Murch even says this, that they went to the telephone exchange for the San Francisco Bay Area, and they had all these people super excited that they were ripping out all the old switches and they were going to the dial tone system. And so if you got a chance to look at that process as them decommissioning all the ancient stuff that had been there for almost 50 years and going to this brand new world where instead of, plugging a cable to connect you from here to there, you just dialed a number. It became a push button world in a way that had never been there before. But at the same time, George Lucas was terrified of that. He was both in love with it and he hated it. And that's where he learned all this. I mean, the scene where they're torturing THX and it's just two guys talking and they're taking the torture device through its range and they're like, wow, I didn't know it did that. And they're just having a normal conversation, but it's such a banality of what's happening to that human being. But no, it's that there brought a realism that he later brought to Star Wars that had not been probably in any science fiction film other than 2001: A Space Odyssey. When you hear the Rebel pilots fly, it is that simplex duplex, shortwave radio communication that anyone that has a shortwave radio license can tell you, but they're using it in THX. He was able to use it and it felt real in a way than any other radio communication would sound. And that's not by accident. He was trying to subliminally show you all these things that would have this effect on you. I mean, you don't remember it, you don't know it, but your brain does. And that's the evil genius of Star Wars was developed here.
Now, Bobby, talking about the realism that you mentioned in THX. So there was this real push in the 70s with a lot of directors, Lucas, Coppola, even Scorsese and De Palma's, just having this like real grittiness to their productions. And THX, I feel, was way ahead of its time, that a lot of the movie-going public didn't really know what to make of it. Now, Tarantino gets credited for the birth of independent cinema, but to me, that was probably the first true independent film that was released in wide release.
The studio would not have put that or greenlighted that on their own. And that was that crop of filmmakers. The studio system was dying. The old studio heads were dying off. They were selling their studios to mega corporations. There was 3 film schools in America at the time. You had UCLA, you had USC, and you had one in New York. And even though they've been around for like 35 years, they never really had anyone that made a big impact. And then Coppola wins Best Screenplay for Patton. And then they greenlight his little family film called The Godfather. And that just shakes up and, changes everything. And he hates the studio system with a passion. He doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And that's why he moves north to the San Francisco Bay Area, and he takes the best luminaries of his generation. And
there's a documentary that George Lucas directed before THX that I would recommend everybody check out. It's called Filmmaker. And George Lucas, when he teamed up with Coppola, one of the first things they did together was George showed up to just shoot his documentary while Coppola directed a movie called The Rain People. And The Rain People is a really interesting film, and it's got some really interesting things in it. This is coincidentally, it also starred Robert Duvall, which is where he and Lucas had met to put them on the path to do THX together. But Filmmakers, I think it's an hour-long documentary, and it really goes through Coppola and Lucas and them sort of explaining in their own very young and in sometimes naive words that exact philosophy about the studio system dying and them being these new mavericks who are coming in to kind of take it over. And I would recommend everybody check it out. I mean, George Lucas shot it himself, edited it, cut it himself, and the sound, even moments in the sound design feel that same way, like you were talking about earlier. With how the sound kind of comes out that way. And you realize that there are things we're so used to seeing George Lucas Star Wars. When you pull back and actually look at his evolution as a filmmaker, you can see that there are things that Star Wars did that we take for granted that were so unique with George building that over his career up to that point.
I think the best jab at the studio system comes in THX at the end with the policeman chasing THX, and the chase stops when they exceed the budget.
Yeah.
Sorry, we can't follow you anymore. Come back. We're out of money for the budget.
Which, I mean, is very indicative of George's political beliefs about money and capitalism and things, where it's just like, we're gonna let whatever happen as long as there's money for it. But that chase is so terrifically shot. For those who don't know, it was filmed in the old the BART tunnels as they were being built in San Francisco, and there's a stunt in there that just takes my breath away every time I see it. And I know they talk about it on the commentary, right?
Yeah,
where
they panicked and ran out to help him, and the stuntman was furious because he said, "You violated stuntman rules. You're supposed to count to 10, finish the shot, and then come check on me, because if I die, this better be in the movie. You better not ruin the shot."
And it's breathtaking. So he does a jump over some debris and flies end over end on his bike and lands and hits the ground hard. Like, it's if there was an Academy Award for stunt work, even though no one liked anything else about THX, it would have won that award, because it was just a really great stunt. And you can see him almost hit the top of the BART tunnel. I don't think they'd let them get away with that stunt today. I think George would probably say, like, we'll do it in post.
He was sick. He was sick because that was his first movie, and he was terrified with what happened, because he's a human being. He's not there to hurt people.
Yeah.
He was trusting what they were saying. I have a bit of news here. Because I follow tech issues and stuff, and I thought when I saw this, I had to share this with you, Brian, because this is right up your alley. It's about Amazon.com and Jeff Bezos. Amazon is installing phone booth-sized boxes for exhausted employees to meditate, receive positive affirmations, and listen to calming sounds. And you can look that up. And I thought blessings of the state, blessings of the masses.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, for those who aren't as familiar with THX, there are these booths with this sort of Renaissance artwork of Jesus's face that you walk into, or Robert Duvall walks into, and they sort of light up in this really odd fluorescent glow, and they sort of take your confession, or your meditation or whatever, but it's this really weird pre-recording that doesn't actually respond to you. Like, it's very awkward and bizarre in the movie in all the best ways, and it doesn't surprise me that Amazon would be heading that direction.
SEN played by Donald Pleasance. I only found this out this year. His speech when he's incarcerated are just Richard Nixon speeches excerpts.
It's also very George. Another thing I found out, actually, a really fascinating thing for me being a MASH nerd, I didn't realize that THX 1138 was the first film that David Ogden Stiers was credited on. He was voices in the control room and whatnot. He was, obviously, for those of you who follow MASH, was Winchester. He was also Cogsworth in the Beauty and the Beast Disney film. But yeah, his start was actually George Lucas with THX providing voices for some of the controllers. It's interesting listening to the soundtrack though, and picking out voices in the movie. Like, I can very clearly hear Walter Murch at a number of times in the movie providing some of that commentary.
Whoa, I think I just ran over a Wookiee.
Yeah. There's so many little things like that. Wookiees came from THX. R2D2 famously kind of came from American Graffiti's Post.
Dialogue too. And yeah, one thing, there was a scene that was cut where they fall into a garbage compactor to fend off a mutant rat, which that was cut out of THX, but of course that situation was reused in A New Hope. So yeah, a lot came out of that movie. And then not only that, I mean, Lucas loves to throw in Easter eggs to his previous production. So of course in American Graffiti, the hot rod, the license plate says THX 138. Of course, that was the name of the sound design company that used to be under Lucasfilm, THX. And of course, it's the name of our event, 1138. So, a lot can be said for his first production.
I think the theme that I like most about his films, and he says, he's the first to admit, yes, obviously you can tell that I stuck with this theme through my first three films, is of the person breaking free of the mold or the strictures of society to go blaze his own path. In fact, that's the reason why most of A New Hope, the early scenes that are deleted and cut with Luke, is because, the other guys making the film said, George, you're remaking American Graffiti in outer space. Think about what you're doing. And he looked at it and went, oh, yeah, I guess I am. Well, I really like American Graffiti. But go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting. One thing, I never really, like, being a huge Star Wars fan, like I am, and like a student of Star Wars, there was an interview with Francis Ford Coppola once, and Coppola has this sort of venom in his voice for Star Wars, and he feels like Star Wars robbed us of all of the films that George would never make. And I used to get very upset at Coppola for being like, well, why are you trying to tell George he shouldn't be working on Star Wars? It's the greatest thing that's ever made. Like, why would you be upset about this? And watching THX and American Graffiti again in preparation of this panel and some other stuff I'm doing, I feel like I understood really for the first time, like, if you look at THX and sort of really the fascinating, interesting promise that it had, and then you look at American Graffiti, and then you look at Star Wars, and then you go, oh, he's stuck with nothing but Star Wars for the rest of his life. It does kind of feel like I wish he would have been making other movies personally as a director, not just as a producer. I mean, we did get Indiana Jones, and we got, for better or worse, Howard the Duck, and we got, Red Tails, I think, is a really great, movie.
Radioland Murders.
Radioland, which I think we should talk about Radioland Murders after we talk about American Graffiti, because he was working on that was going to be his movie before Star Wars. It was going to be right after right after American Graffiti, and it got announced in the trades. So there's all kinds of ads in the trades announcing that he was making Radioland Murders before Star Wars.
People also forget that before Star Wars, that was when Apocalypse Now was supposed to start filming, which George was going to direct.
Yeah.
And it damaged their relationship pretty badly. And I think the nod that Francis gives to George is that he has Harrison Ford play Colonel Lucas, in that role. Like, oh, look, here you are, George. There's Colonel Lucas, and it's Harrison Ford. But that was a nightmare that almost killed
Coppola
himself. So it's not like he could wish that on his friend. George may never have lived through the filming in the Philippines had he gone.
He barely lived through the filming of A New Hope.
I think he loves Star Wars. He said in the first documentary, he said there's always friends there, but I think he has very ambivalent feelings because of the toll it took on him personally, friendships.
Yeah.
Because we're looking at American Graffiti was when he was with Gary Kurtz. And I think those guys were a terrific team. They were on the same page, living and breathing everything they did. Do we want to transition to start talking about American Graffiti?
Well, yeah. Right before we do that, I just want to point out that where Lucas got the name THX 1138. It was actually his old phone number in San Francisco at the time, where 849, the digits on an old, dial-up phone, if anyone remembers those, THX. So even from the beginning, he's using, things from his real life to name his films, his characters. You mentioned R2D2 comes from Real 2 Dialogue 2. So, I mean, it's just kind of great background. But yes, let's go ahead and talk about American Graffiti. It's one of those movies that, and again, it's a classic. And rewatching it recently, I was a big fan of Dazed and Confused when that came out in the 90s. Of course, that was very, it was Richard Linklater's callback to, his time in the 70s. It's almost like a spiritual successor to American Graffiti in a lot of ways. And, watching the movie, I can think back to my own high school days back in the 90s that we used to cruise around and just idle chit chat, and, there was drag racing involved. So, that's generational. So it's kind of amazing. And the soundtrack is just, spot on of the 50s. Of course,
Fantastic.
This was George Lucas's, growing up in the 50s in Marin County. Of course, the movie was based out in Modesto, so it's a lot of his real life of what he lived.
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Well, I was going to say one thing about the film that I think is really remarkable. I was kind of doing the math again in preparation from this. American Graffiti came out in 73. It's set in 62. And when you think about that, that would be like somebody today making a movie about 2010.
That was a good year. I met you then.
Which just, that was a good year. Which just goes to show you how fast things changed then. And it seems like we've reached some sort of cultural entropy where I could barely tell you, what 2010 looks like versus 2020.
Well, that's because our generation is different and does not have this pivoting event. My grandmother used to talk about things before the war and after the war. And you knew what she was talking about, because she was talking about World War II. And for my dad's generation and my mother's generation, it's the death of President Kennedy. And everything that happened in the 10 years following that, I mean, you think about it, Vietnam happened, the absolute overturning and inside out of our culture, the sexual revolution, changes in our cities, everything, these are people looking back 10 years ago, 11 years ago, and that looks like another planet. It looks like something out of a storybook. It's not since probably the Civil War has a generation gone through that much cultural change. Richard Dreyfuss said that he auditioned for the part and he talked to George. He says, George, I'm trying to play this as someone looking back 20 years on his past wanting to make this the greatest night of his life so he can look back on it 20 years later and go, wow, that was a great night. I was with all my friends. And that's why the coda of the film, you find out what happens to everyone. And Toad is dead. And Paul Matt's character has died in a car accident. And it's just shocking. But that's true. You know, that's real. My dad helps plan his class reunions because the class officers of his high school class died in Vietnam. You know, thank God I don't have to deal with that. I don't really know anyone that I went to high school with that went through something like that, because that's earth-shattering. And I think George hit on such a raw nerve that, you know, because right after this, we had a Love American Style, we had Happy Days. Sha Na Na had been around. Sha Na Na was at Woodstock. People forget that. But then they exploded, and Bowser was everywhere, and this music was everywhere. And the careers of people who had long since been gone were coming back because, you know, this was the demarcation line. It was, where were you in the summer of '62? And that's the question they were asking. That's the tagline of the film. And I don't know if George was cognizant of what he was doing, but that, you know, he hit it right dead center.
I think there is a moment of it. I think there is a moment where he is cognizant, because there is that moment when Kurt is in the car with his ex-girlfriend and Bobby, and his ex-girlfriend is telling Bobby the story about how his biggest dream is to be able to shake hands with President Kennedy. And there's this vulnerability there just around the mention of Kennedy and sort of the way Kurt plays it, or Richard Dreyfuss plays it. And it's yeah, I think he knew he was looking back at that moment just before things were going to change.
I love that night. Is just for so many people of that generation. It is a perfect one-to-one representation of what life was like, especially for back there in the car culture and Western California. I mean, it's pretty much gone now, but it's nice that it was captured in a way that felt real. I don't think I've ever watched it with someone watching it for the first time and seen how Toad went to buy alcohol for the first time underage without people going, yeah, that's how it happens. You find a guy in flannel. Can you go buy me a bottle?
It's a pint of Old Harper. You know, it's interesting. There's a moment, George, I think part of the reason he was so attracted to film Apocalypse Now, and part of the reason Coppola shot so much footage on Apocalypse Now, was because he was trying to replicate this documentary style that George was really good at. And if you listen to the commentary or watch any of the behind the scenes on American Graffiti, the actors would almost get annoyed that it was the takes that they screwed up that they knew George would print, right? So like in the opening sequence, when Terry crashes his Vespa into the newspaper machine, or when Debbie, you know, slurs the words like, did you get it? Did you get it? Like, it was because he was looking for that realism. And I watching THX and watching American Graffiti back to back, I know a lot of people say like, oh, George Lucas is terrible with actors. I don't think he is. Even with the Star Wars movies, I think he gets exactly what he wants out of them. We as an audience might not always like what he gets out of them and what he wants out of them, but he gets exactly what he wants out of them, and I think he knows how.
Well, that's what's his name, Wexler, who did a Medium Cool. Haskell Wexler. Yeah. That's the guy who really stepped up and tried to help George out. And if you watch Medium Cool and the films that he did, you can see who. I'm not saying that he's copying him, but he's definitely one of the influences and peers that he deeply admired. He's trying to, you know, I mean, Medium Cool is a film of the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, and they're making a film, and oh look, a riot breaks out. Keep rolling. That's amazing. And I mean, you got to be in the right place, right time for something like that to happen. But it definitely made a serious impact on George.
Lucas had those moments too. I think people forget that he was one of the cameramen on Gimme Shelter, the documentary, the Maisels Brothers documentary about the Rolling Stones concert at the Altamont Speedway, where they knifed that guy. And Lucas was there filming in the crowd, and that documentary style was really part of his DNA.
But he loved it. He fed off of it, and I do not think. And he says he had no intention to make commercial films. You know, Star Wars was going to be his one and done. And how did he know it was going to be a cultural phenomenon?
Yeah, no, especially after the reception that THX had, and then I mean, American Graffiti was it was well received. It made a lot of money back, and it was the strength of American Graffiti that got Alan Ladd Jr. on board to give him Star Wars. But there's that famous story where they showed it to the studio the first time, and the studio was just like, "This is garbage. Why did we buy this?" And Coppola had to walk over to them and say, like, "You don't understand what this young man has done for you, the favor that he's done your studio. And if you don't want to make all the money from this, I will buy it from you now." And he whipped out his checkbook right then and there. And they're like, "Well, we'll make some changes." And they cut a few scenes from it and altered some things. And the version we have now is again, Lucas's definitive version, according to him. But the way he described it was that it's like them coming and telling you they're going to cut one of your children's fingers off. And there's no necessary reason for it. They'll be fine afterward. They're not going to live life, you know, in some horrible, demeaning way because their finger's missing, but they're going to do it because they can. Yeah. And that was sort of how they treated both THX and American Graffiti. And so you can understand why he'd want to have that control over Star Wars.
And I think that led to everything, particularly his breakup with Gary Kurtz. You know, the Empire went over budget.
Yeah.
George went and got money for going over budget because he wasn't going to turn over control to the studios, but he was furious that he had to do it. And, you know, I'm talking, this is a defining characteristic of who he was and everything up to that point. And if you knew that, you knew that things were going to be bad because of it. American Graffiti made over $200 million in box office gross and home video sales. This was a movie that cost $770,000 to make. And I mean, it's the Blair Witch Project of its age.
Yeah,
and you're talking dollars put in and dollars you got out. It launched a dozen careers: Richard Dreyfuss, Cindy Williams, Charles Martin Smith, Ron Howard. Ron Howard now being taken seriously as an adult actor. You know, we have Candy Clark, Donna Summers, Wolfman Jack. Wolfman Jack becomes a cultural icon for the next 20 years. It's really, really astounding. Oh, and a young Harrison Ford playing Bob Falfa.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because, you know, Harrison didn't want to cut his hair. So it's like, all right, I'll just wear a cowboy hat. It's like, is this the first instance of an iconic hat being worn by Harrison Ford in a Lucas production?
You know, the thing that really gets me about Harrison Ford is that he has a deep loyalty to the people that helped make him who he is. People forget that he did a cameo again as Bob Falfa in more American Graffiti. He played the motorcycle cop.
Yeah.
People are like, "What? What are you talking about?" Yeah, he played the motorcycle cop, and you know, and
that was in '79 when he was at the top of the world.
And think about also that he played the principal in the deleted scenes from E.T.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he you know, so his scenes didn't end up in that movie, but he ended up with a wife. So he married Melissa Matheson, the screenwriter. And I just think that he's a guy that I think he has a lot of gratitude to George and Steve. And if you call him up, he'll go on down, you know, and won't make a big fuss about it because, I mean, even now, if you check out any interview, he's incredibly grateful because he was a carpenter. Acting didn't work out. and then through I mean, how many other studios were doing casting in groups like that? Was that a very well-known thing? Was that a popular thing?
Well, I think that might have been a Fred Roos thing. So Fred Roos was the casting director that he'd used in that era, that George Lucas had used in that era. And he was doing it. I don't know if it was just for that group, but they were doing it for Carrie and Star Wars at the same time. And they were sort of mixing and matching both. And both he and I think it was De Palma.
For Carrie.
Yeah. For Carrie, yeah. The two of them were casting together and just trying to double up that time. So I'm not sure if it was common the way they were doing that or not. But it was definitely it worked the way it did. It's so fascinating watching those old screen tests and auditions that they had. You can find footage of those all over the place. And yeah.
I look at I now, now I'm an older man. I can look at the four male characters in American Graffiti and realize those are the four personas of George Lucas. You have Toad, who's the nerd. You have your gearhead. You have Carl, the one who's going to leave and go on his adventure, and then you have the one who wants Ron Howard's going to stay because he doesn't want to go, and that these were all the four fighting personas of George Lucas.
It's funny. He said, I'm not sure which, again, I've watched so many documentaries and read so many books and listened to so many commentaries about all these movies. So I don't remember where this came from precisely, but he talked about the reason that he needed Willard Huck and Gloria Katz to do the revisions on the screenplay, because he had written the first draft, was mainly so they could help him figure out Steve and Laurie's part, because that was the one he felt most disconnected to. That it was the part that he was struggling the most with. And that was where he needed the most help, because he did understand Toad and Kurt and John Milner implicitly in a way he said that he didn't understand Steve. And it's interesting that they came in and they helped with, future drafts of other stuff. And they ended up going on and writing Temple of Doom. And they were the ones that their experience working with George on American Graffiti went so well. That's why they started working with him on Radioland Murders. It's an interesting story too. I don't know if we want to get into it, but I did an interview with Rick McCallum recently for Star Wars Insider, and he talked about why they made Radioland Murders, and it was just sort of a lark. They had the script, they had they were shooting Young Indiana Jones, and there was an earthquake where they were going to shoot, so they had 2 months of insurance time, and George was like, what the hell, let's make Radioland Murders. And he went out, they shot it at Dino De Laurentiis's studio in North Carolina. He's like, I thought it would be really fascinating to bring the English crew out to North Carolina at this really weird studio and shoot it. But again, it was George trying to push the envelope, because they were trying to figure out how they could take all of the digital techniques that they were building in Young Indiana Jones to make that show on a shoestring, to figure out how they could do that on a film scale, on a big screen, so that it wouldn't feel weird, to see if they could apply that to Star Wars if he was going to step into Star Wars again. And so Radioland Murders has this really interesting place before A New Hope, and also before the prequels, as these really important milestones in what George was doing in between his bouts of Star Wars.
All right. Well, before we move on to our next topic here, I do just want to remind everyone, the viewers, of our donation from First. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have a challenge from not only D. Bradley Baker, but also Bobby Moynihan, to get 100 people to donate $66 towards First. So if you do that, both D. Bradley Baker and Bobby Moynihan will match $6,600 each. So we are over $8,800 right now. So keep them coming. So yeah, great stories about THX, American Graffiti, and also Radioland Murders, and which is funny, because we actually mentioned that in the last segment with Bobby Moynihan, because that's one of the Lucasfilm productions that don't really get a lot of mention. And what do you think that is?
I think part of it is that no one saw it. Rick McCallum told me a story about how the head of Universal called him at one point and said that it was the movie that made the least amount of money without going like bankrupt. Like it made the least amount of money that they've ever had on a profitable film that Universal had ever released. And it was just no one saw it. And I don't think anybody knew what to do with it either. I mean, George Lucas is obsessed and has been obsessed with sort of repackaging these ideas that intrigued him in his youth and this nostalgia. You see that in American Graffiti. And I think in a weird way, you see it with THX, right? Where he's trying to manufacture nostalgia for something science fiction from a hypothetical point 300 years in the future from an alien planet or something, right? And Radioland Murders was his love of those 30s screwball comedies. And, you know, in the early 90s, maybe that's not what audiences are responding to. And George, for better or for worse, cares about what he cares about, and the market doesn't really matter. I think if Star Wars would have come out 10 years later or 20 years later, it wouldn't have been the cultural phenomenon it was necessarily. It happened to come out and hit at exactly the right time. And I think George made it when he could, and he'd be damned if anybody was going to tell him how. And it was just sort of lightning in a bottle that it hit the way it did. And
right time, right place.
Yeah. And I think George is like that with all of his, with everything he's ever done, has just been, this is what I want to do and we're going to do it. And if it's the right time, right place, great. And if not, oh, well, we'll lose money on it. Cough, Howard the Duck, cough.
Now, what would you think would have happened had Radioland Murders released in the 70s instead of Star Wars? How would that have changed Lucas's career?
I wonder if he would have been able to make Star Wars at that point, if he would have been making Star Wars. I doubt Radioland Murders would have disappeared the way it did, right? Like, I think the cast they were organizing at the time was going to be something that would be able to pull in box office in a way that maybe their cast in the 90s didn't necessarily, especially since they had like 2 months to put the entire movie together. The fact that they ended up with a viewable movie out of that is shocking. Generally,
movies like that were very popular in the late 70s. If
yeah.
you want to watch an excellent one, watch Murder by Death.
Yeah.
Which is
which coincidentally perfect. Is the movie that Alec Guinness was just finishing up when George Lucas handed him the screenplay for A New Hope. Because he played the butler in that movie. And it's weird how all those 70s movies are connected, but yeah, you're exactly right. They were very popular in that day and age. And I wonder if we didn't get Star Wars, then maybe we would have gotten more of those THXs. Maybe we would have had more of those, you know, George Lucas takes on Apocalypse Now and more of those American Graffiti. He really wanted to make more American Graffiti, actually. He wanted to direct that, and he felt like because it had made so much money, he wanted to explore that territory again. And he ended up passing on it because he was in pre-production on Empire, and he was in pre-production on Raiders of the Lost Ark, and just felt like he was too busy to take it on. And I don't think, you know, I think More American Graffiti is another one of the, I think fewer people have probably seen More American Graffiti than Radioland Murders, at least in the circles I travel in. And I think part of that is because I don't know, we just forget that George had as much of a hand in that as any of the other movies that he produced in that era. He and Howard Kazanjian hired the filmmaker, the director that took it over, that wrote it, and they executive produced it the same way that they did a lot of the Star Wars films, where George was there in the editing room helping with it and putting it together. It wasn't the best reviewed film, but then when you look at it now in retrospect, it has such an odd structure to it. And it's obviously trying to push the boundary and do something different with storytelling, the way I think American Graffiti did. You don't think of a lot of movies like American Graffiti taking 4 characters that are only loosely related and having their own sort of stories and come together. You know, you think of art house films now that do that sort of thing. Robert Altman's Shortcuts, P.T. Anderson's Magnolia. There's not a whole lot of films that follow that pattern. And then you see More American Graffiti trying to push the envelope further, where it's 4 distinct looks at New Year's Eves across the lives of all these characters as they check in with them.
Well, part of the thing that really hampered it is when it first came on video and people were watching in pan and scan, and this was a film that had multiple frames floating through the screen. If you're watching pan and scan, you don't know what the heck you're looking at.
Yeah.
Never meant to be viewed that way. And
Yeah, no, and I mean, there's a lot of innovation that Lucas did. Part of the reason he needed Haskell Wexler on American Graffiti was just like pushing the boundary of how he could shoot it and how he could shoot it cheaply. I love that they did like Poor Man's Anamorphic, where the film looks like it's shot in 16 millimeter, but they shot it in 35 and only exposed half the frame so they could get the width of it. So it's still, it's not that anamorphic 2:3:5 ratio. They had to cheat that and use only half of each frame of film in order to extend their camera budget and make the film fast enough for the light they needed to shoot everything at night.
I have right here, when Radioland Murders came out, and it came out in October of 1994, the number one movie in America at that time was Stargate. And that was also the year that Pulp Fiction hit, The Shawshank Redemption, Forrest Gump, Time Cop, Natural Born Killers, Clear and Present Danger, The Mask, Ed Wood,
Tough competition.
Speed, the first Next Generation Star Trek movie, Generations, came out. Clerks had just appeared. Interview with a Vampire. There's just that year was very, very dense.
Yeah.
Wyatt Earp, Don Juan, The Crow. I mean, it was an incredibly dense year, and I think it is a matter of timing that if you were in the right place, right time, it might have gotten more traction than what it did.
Yeah, no, it's interesting how they can hit like that, how filmmakers can slot those movies in really how they do that. Barry Levinson did that with Wag the Dog when he was waiting on special effects to come back on Sphere. And it's funny because I don't think anybody talks about Sphere, but everybody talks about Wag the Dog, which was just in that little gap. And Rian Johnson with Knives Out, it was just a gap in filming between for Daniel Craig and the woman who played Marta, because they were waiting on stuff for the new James Bond movie. And it's funny that they shot that after No Time to Die, but No Time to Die still hasn't come out, and Knives Out was a hit.
But it's funny you mentioned No Time to Die, because there's a period for about 2 years I would host a James Bond movie every month leading up to No Time to Die. That was supposed to come out 2 years ago. So
yeah,
it's just that movie has just been cursed. But I digress. So on our prequel panel, you mentioned that you watch a lot of classic movies, some of the silent films, things like that. And Bob, I know you've watched a lot of movies from all eras. So before THX, before American Graffiti, the end credits were usually very short, which show you just like the top names and things like that. But since American Graffiti, you go to a movie now, you're sitting through 5 to 7 minutes of everyone that worked in that film. So that's another testament of something that George Lucas did that no one else at the time was doing. That's now commonplace today.
As Kermit the Frog once said during an opening credit, I'm sure they have families.
It's funny though. I mean, that got Lucas in trouble when he was working on Star Wars, not having any credit, because they ended up kicking him out of the Directors Guild because they wouldn't bend their rules to let him not take the credit at the beginning of the film, and instead do it afterward. He just did what he wanted. He did what he wanted throughout his entire career, and I think we've all been. We've all received the benefits of George just being George.
It is his greatest strength, and I also think at times it can be a weakness. But luckily, it has been more of a strength than a weakness. Wouldn't be here today.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have met you guys. I don't know how I would have crossed paths with all of you.
All right. Yeah, and Bob, you used to live down here, and the first time we met was at a troop. The toy store over here, Order 66. I believe it was with Timothy Zahn, the author. So yeah, it's like Star Wars, George Lucas, and 501st. I mean, it's all connected.
I play video games with friends in Germany. I talk to a friend in the Netherlands quite frequently, friends in Australia, Japan, all around the world. And it's been that way for well over 13 years now. And it's all because of meeting them through Star Wars. And it's utterly insane. They're in my life. I'm in their lives. We get together, we see each other. And, you know, I love the movies. I mean, look at my house. You just blow. I'm look at your places. Yeah, but you know, at the end of the day, the greatest gift I have is the people that have come into my life, and there's no greater gift than that. And at the end of the day, I hope George knows that, and the other people at Lucasfilm, particularly those in the early days, know what they did and the ripples that continue to grow that are affecting everyone's lives in so many ways, professionally, personally.
Absolutely true. And, you know, I've been with the 501st for 5 years now, and I've met a lot of people in my time. And honestly, it's just been a short time, but it feels like I've met a lifetime worth of friends that I now consider family. And it's all because of, you know, 50 years ago, you know, a student filmmaker decided that, all right, I'm going to start making films. And it just snowballed. And it is now this massive thing that has brought us all together.
Well, and I want to say real quick about that. There's a lot of people that tell stories, and you know, filmmaking is the art of telling stories. And I think George wanted to tell stories, but I also think that he wanted you to feel, and that really comes across in these early films. You know, American Graffiti is a film with no main character, and it jumps around and all that, but you feel and you have this emotional connection. And that's every product he's ever made is something that makes us feel. And I think that's what draws us together, probably more than anything else now, because this is we definitely need that.
There's that thread of sort of found family through all of his movies too, that I think we all experience, right? That seems like it's important to him. And I think it's probably, he appreciates that it happens outside of the art, but inside the art with THX, you have Thex and Law sort of coming together and saying, like, we're choosing each other instead of being assigned to each other like our society is. And that's what THX is after. And in American Graffiti, it's about this found family of friends and how they're actually going to cope with their lives and moving on, or maybe not moving on with each other. And, you know, Star Wars is really about people coming together as well, all of them. Right. And so I think that he's been able to inspire people like us to come together through all of his movies, through his entire career. I don't think that's an accident either.
All right. Well, Bryan, you know, that's an excellent point. And, you know, all of his films involve family of some point. And, you know, it's family is what brings us together. But I want to thank you both. It's been a great conversation, you know, talking about the early days of Lucasfilm and how it just kind of steamrolled into what we have today. So, and before I let you all go, just one last reminder, please, everyone out there listening, if you can, open up your wallets. You can go to our link. You can scan the QR code on the screen. And we're looking for donations of $66. But if you can't donate $66, any amount would help. So once again, thank you, and hope everyone enjoys.